Okay. Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to Estrad. Today we have a special guest, one of the pioneers in the entrepreneurship research field. Per Davidsson is based in Australia since 2004, but we have been able to invite him to Estrad during his visit in Sweden. But first, a few words about ESPRI, the organization that arranged these lectures. My name is Helene Torgrimsson, and I work as a project manager at ESPRI. We disseminate research-based knowledge in different ways through these Estrad lectures and other events, through our magazine Entré, and on our website you will find web TV and a lot of articles about entrepreneurship, innovation, and small business. Today's lecture will start soon. We don't have any break today. Per will talk for about an hour, and then we have questions and fika with coffee and some nice buns. I would like to thank our main partners, Tillväxtverket and Vinnova, and our partner, Länsstyrelsen in Stockholm. Okay, that was all for me. Enter the stage, please, Per.
Thank you. So, and this is the clicker. Okay, welcome. Great to see you all here. Great to be back, and first time, apparently it's my 7th time in an Estrad lecture since 1997, but this is the first time in this more entrepreneurial venue that we now have. So I'm going to talk about this theme. I had a different title first, but Magnus said, well, you got to beef that one up. So that's why we have this new title. When I talk about creating new business, independent startups is my main interest, but new business can also be corporate venturing, and a lot of what I say is also relevant to growth of existing businesses. So, okay, this is Rodney Brooks. Rodney Brooks, he is an Australian robotics professor at MIT, or he was a professor at MIT. He has become a robotics entrepreneur. And he visited us about 18 months ago and gave a lunch speech. And in that speech, what he was talking about connected nicely with those ideas that we have been developing in our research. So if you are a robotics professor, of course, new technology will be important to what you're doing. Even if you're a robotics professor and robotics entrepreneur, most of the technological development will be done by others. So it is something external that is given as an opportunity to you to do something with, right? But he did not speak much about that. He spoke about this. This is the demographic development in China. And as you can see, it is narrowing at the bottom there. What does that mean? Well, one implication is that there will not be enough Chinese to fill those mega factories. At the same time, there is some socioeconomic development in China as well. So these young people do not see their future in those factories. And that means that the market for industrial robots will develop quite a bit. He also spoke about this. This is the demographic development in Japan, which is even more extreme. And as you can see, it's not a population pyramid in 2060. It looks like a population torso or something like that. One implication of that is that whether we like the idea or not, robot-assisted solutions for taking care of the elderly may not be something we can do without, with that kind of population structure. So demographic and socioeconomic shifts are also important external changes that open up business opportunities. He also spoke about 9/11. He spoke about Fukushima. He spoke about the Afghan war. these are very tough environments where humans don't want to operate unless they have to. So that is environments for rustic robots to do what people can't do or won't do. So even natural and man-made disasters open up new opportunities for some businesses. Now for something completely different. Rodney Brooks didn't speak about this. This is about the temperance movement, nykterhetsrörelsen. What does that have to do with this? Well, it turns out there was a nice piece of research in one of the most prestigious scholarly journals about 9 years ago, about the temperance movement and one of the and the economic effects of this, right? And one of the unintended effects of the temperance movement was a boom in soft drink startups. Why? Why does this movement to get rid of alcohol and its bad consequences lead to an increase on soft drink startups? Suggestions?
Maybe the soft drinks are a substitute to alcohol.
So that is the first obvious thing you think about. So demand substitution? Okay, sorry. So the suggestion was that maybe soft drinks is a substitute to alcohol. And that will be part of it, right? That if you can't drink beer, you maybe drink a soft drink instead. And that may be true for beer as a lunch drink or beer as a dinner drink, but it doesn't really gel with the blokes who go down to the pub and have 4 lagers and a bitter. They won't go down and have 4 Cokes and a Pepsi, or 4 Cokes and a Fanta. So you won't cover that market in this way. But there may be other things at work as well as the demand substitution effect. And that is one of the main points here. We should look more deeply into what may be the effects of those external changes and how can individual businesses use that. Another nice piece of research 10 years ago was a Canadian study that they sort of did Schumpeter with a twist, underlining the importance of the destructive part of creative destruction, namely how exits drive entry. And they show this quite convincingly, that as long as the economy is not so bad that you have extended periods of high numbers of exits, this churning is really important. And it makes a lot of sense. The human resources, from the entrepreneurs to managers to factory workers who had experience from the brewing industry, for example, which dwindled, they have skills that are relevant to the soft drink industry. And there would be facilities, there would be equipment and machinery that some of it could be converted. So resource expansion is another mechanism at work here. Alternatively, you could call it conservation, that it saves, this external change saves on resources, namely in this case on financial resources. You can get those physical and human resources at a lower cost than you previously could. So if you think a little bit more about it, so they in this study they only implied the demand substitution effect, right? But so you have a socio-cultural change, the temperance movement, which led to a regulatory change that had even stronger effect on this market for alcoholic beverages, right? But then you also had some technological change, namely refrigeration. And as Swedes, we like to think of this as a Swedish innovation by von Platen and Munters. Now, if you have increased refrigeration, that makes the soft drinks more attractive than they are without refrigeration at certain times and in certain regions, right? So that helps as well. And we also have macroeconomic development, and especially in the 1920s, which was the height of prohibition, when you had economic growth and you're growing middle class, and perfect for this kind of non-necessary consumption. Give the kids a soda as a treat, right? Which hadn't happened so much before. So it wasn't just about the immediate demand substitution. You have those, and it wasn't only about the temperance movement. You had those other changes as well, which would help this. A similar kind of movement that we are in the middle of now is veganism. When I first came close to vegans, that was sort of in the early 90s in Umeå. They were extremists that would set fire on the trucks at the local abattoir, the slaughterhouse, and so forth. It wasn't very easy to see that this would grow into the mainstream, but it has, right? And this has created and will create a lot of opportunities for businesses, not just immediately with food and restaurants and so forth, but in cosmetics, in clothes and shoes, because you want alternatives to leather or anything else that is made from animal, books and magazines, and even travel, for example. And these are probably some of the more obvious. If you give it some more thought, you probably find more that is already or will be affected by this. As regards technologies, we in this paper looked at the recent surge in IT hardware startups. There has been a very marked increase in independent startups in the IT hardware industry. And we looked at how a range of digital technologies has enabled this. And it turns out, and I might come back to this towards the end of the speech, that it was not a single technology or a single mechanism, a single effect, but a range of technologies that helped startups in this industry in a number of ways, by saving time, saving resources, making it possible to provide new product features and so forth. And these mechanisms pertain to different stages of the business development process, which was also very important, because if it's just easy to start playing, you may have a lot of buzz happening. If you don't help these businesses also through the valley of death and into full-scale production, there may not be much of an effect, at least not in the number of independent startups. There may be good ideas that get absorbed into other structures. So our idea is that there is a point in looking at this range of seemingly different types of changes and look at what is it in a more detailed manner that they do. There is quite a bit of research on the aggregate level. So you have those changes and you have a change in the rate of startups and so forth. But we don't have a lot that tries to connect this to the level of the individual decision maker, to the individual venture. How precisely can they get benefits out of those changes? And we think there is a point in doing that. So an external enabler, as we use the term, is a significant external change, such as new technologies, political and regulatory changes, demographic and social shifts, and changes to the natural environment, which can play an essential role in eliciting and or enabling a variety of startups. I'm not the only one who talked about external change enabling, but I deepened the definition and discussion of this in this paper from 2015. So it's an aggregate level phenomenon. It is something that may be relevant to more than one venture, maybe many ventures. So it's not some idiosyncratic circumstance that happens to be useful for a particular venture. It is something broader than that. This enabler is a positive term, right? So, and there was a problem which I pointed out in this strongly in this article from 2015 with the notion of entrepreneurial opportunity as used as a research term. In lay speak, we do well with it and we can't do without it, but it is a bit complicated as a research term. And this assumed favorability, so we deal with this just as a theoretical assumption, supported by historical experience, that anything that stirs up the economic system will be of potential benefit to some ventures. It may overall be very negative for the economy. That's not the point. Anything that stirs up the system will open up some possibility for some ventures. But it is not a complete success recipe for any individual venture, and it is not necessarily societal beneficial overall. We will have some horrible examples, terrorist attacks, natural disasters we have already talked about. So we have those different types of enablers: new technology, regulatory change, demographic shift, socio-cultural, economic or political shift, and changes to the natural environment. I won't go into detail. And that is not new and has been talked about before, but we try to de-emphasize what type of venture it is and go into what are the characteristics that may be different and shared within and across those different changes. And why is that important? We have something, a very strong psychological tendency as human beings, and researchers are not immune, and that is to seek explanations for actions and outcomes, firstly in terms of the people involved. So we overemphasize the people side and we underemphasize situational effects. And this is one of the biggest examples, of course, of emphasizing the individual. I would say this is one of the cases where it is also most relevant. I think this is an individual who, without doubt, has made a difference. Things would not have developed exactly the same without Steve Jobs. It wouldn't be the case that someone else would have stepped up. In many other cases, you could argue that, actually. They happened to be this person, but obviously someone else would have done it. So he made a real difference. Let's see how big we make the heroic individual. He's so much bigger than this other guy, whatever his name is. But even in this, maybe the archetypical case of an individual making a difference, you have a whole host of technological development which was not initiated or funded by Apple or developed within Apple, that were absolutely essential to the iPhone and what it has become, the iPod, the iPhone, or the iPad. So they do not operate in a vacuum. They don't create literally something from nothing. There needs to be some raw material. So we're developing some ideas around this that we call the external enabler framework, and we have a couple of publications on this, but it is work in progress. So I intend to put some more energy into this and in the years to come. So we summarize this here and we say, okay, agents, that is people, those who actually act, they are important. We get that. Others do a lot of research on that. We can plug that in and apply that to our stuff, but it's not what we emphasize here. Context. Now, external enablers are about context. We pick one big thing and then we don't talk so much about context otherwise in this framework. Context is also important. We get that. The effects of a new technology or a new regulation or a natural disaster will be different if it happens in California, whether compared to if it happens in Pakistan or somewhere. We get that. Others look at that as well. We can plug that into this as well, but we don't make that our main emphasis. We recognize that there are different types of changes and there may be differences that it's driven by the fact that there are those different types. It is something we will have reason to look more deeply into, but it is not the main emphasis. We instead make it a point to try to look across them and see that within a type there may be variance in characteristics and mechanism, and across types there may be the same kind of benefits that the businesses can get. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at characteristics of external enabler, and we come up with two main characteristics: the scope, how far-reaching is this change in terms of spatial, temporal, sectoral, and socio-demographic scope. I'll get back to that. Another character is the onset. How does this happen? Is it very gradual or is it very sudden? Is it predictable or does it happen completely out of the blue? These two dimensions are likely correlated, but they're not exactly the same. Then we talk about mechanisms. So characteristics are characteristics of the enabler themselves. The mechanisms would be different depending on what exact venture you're trying to start, but you can't derive just any mechanism from any enabler. So there's a limit to what you can get from a particular enabler. So we talk about a range of different mechanisms. They may pertain to the supply side, they may pertain to the demand side, or they may pertain to the appropriability, how easy, making it easier to appropriate more of the value that you create. Those mechanisms have characteristics as well, and we call them opacity and agency intensity. Opacity has to do with, is this something that is obvious? Any idiot can see that this will have this effect for this kind of venture, or you need to have really special knowledge or a certain abnormal level of creativity in order to come up with it. And agency intensity, is it something that just happens automatically? You don't have to do anything. It will benefit certain types of ventures anyway. Or is it something that requires a lot of hard work and time and investment and so forth in order to get this favorable mechanism out of this external change? And then we talk about different roles of these, so that they can have for a particular venture. There may be a triggering role that in anticipation of some favorable mechanisms, some particular benefits, this becomes a reason for trying to start a new business in the first place. It can have an outcome enhancing role, and that is of course what we hope that these anticipated mechanisms will have, but they may be outcome enhancing without being triggering. So they somewhere along the journey we realize that this may be used in this way in order to get a better result. Or in the stream case, it may benefit a venture without the founders ever realizing that they are benefiting from this external change. During the journey, we have the shaping role, and that is, so it gives shape to the venture. And it can give shape to the product or service, what you offer the market. It's the features or the price. It can, without affecting the product, it can affect the venture, how it is organized, the business model, or it can act as a catalyst or a utensil that it facilitates the process of getting the new business started. But it doesn't leave any trace in what is offered the market or how the venture is organized. So this is sort of, if we develop our thoughts around this, that is something we can go back to and think, okay, now this has happened. What kind of things can we possibly derive from that change for what kind of venture at what stage of development? Is this all hat? We're certainly not the first who have talked about changes out there being important to businesses, or to some businesses. More in the practice side, you have PESTEL, you have SWOT, you have megatrends, and those kinds of things. In the academic literature, you come across the notion of objective pre-existing opportunities. external shocks, environmental jolts, or institutional change. That all of these cover some parts of what we're trying to do here. And for the academics in the room, if we have any, so institutional theory and the notion of institutional change. This is, among what is available, one of the more well-developed theoretical frameworks, or rather a range of theoretical frameworks, because there's more than one variety of and more than one origin of institutional theory. For the most part, institutional theory is created in order to explain stability rather than change. So that is sort of a problem. There are limits to the applicability of this kind of theorizing for entrepreneurial phenomena. Not all of those kinds of changes that we are talking about can easily or comfortably be called institutions or institutional change. So the external enabler construct covers more ground. And research under this label tends to focus mostly on the aggregate level. So you have some kind of change, and you have a change in the rate of startup activity, but not so much detailed knowledge for strategic micro-level action. External shocks, environmental jolts, these are basically labels for rather sudden changes to the external environment. They're not really associated with a well-developed theoretical framework. Again, tends to focus on the aggregate level. Change leads to change in rates of startups. And again, not all changes are institutions or institutional change. Not all changes are shocks or jolts. Some, like an aging population, is something that is very gradual and predictable. It's not a sudden shock. The article I wrote back in 2015 was out of frustration with this research on entrepreneurial opportunities, which started for very good reasons. Sort of a famous article back from 2000 talk about the individual opportunity nexus, and that, just like I said about this fundamental attribution error, there had been too much focus on the individual. We also need to look at that on which they act, which they called opportunities, and which they saw as pre-existing objective phenomena. And this is intuitively appealing. It can cover any type of external circumstances, so it's not limited as some of the other alternatives in that regard. Usually refers to the micro level. Scott Shane, who was one of the people behind this Nexus thing, in another article from 2000, he looked at the first 8 startups based on 3-dimensional printing. So that's how old that is. So it was already an academic article in entrepreneurship and social science in 2000, after a few years of research and publication process. The first patents are from back in the 1980s. So only the last few years it becomes sort of a household kind of thing. So, and he then called 3D printing the technology, and the 8 businesses that were developed, that was what he looked at as the opportunities, right? Oh, now I did it. And it has proven very hard, controversial and imprecise. There are various sorts of criticism against this notion that some kind of mirror image of the precise realized venture existed as a constellation of circumstances before anyone perceived it or imagined it or started to act on it. And there has been limited progress. Although people sort of agree, yeah, they have rebalancing research, not looking just on the individual, that's a good idea, but yeah. So, and that was what I wrote about in this article, which currently is the best cited entrepreneurship article in the leading entrepreneurship research journal in the world since its publication. So that's one of my favorite boasting points right now. So I say that this notion of opportunity is too complex, not just their version of it, but how others use it. But we pack at least 3 different things into one concept. And one is the new venture idea. This is sort of the imagined future venture. What you are going to produce, for whom, and how you're going to organize that. Right? So an idea about this. Then you have those objective things that Shane and Venkataraman were after. There are circumstances in the environment that open up new possibilities. And then the third thing is someone's belief that this what they're looking at, if it is an external enabler or if it is a new venture idea. Their belief, their subjective belief that this is an opportunity, this is something positive, this is something that is going to be successful. And we can't have, all of these can change independently over time, so to pack them into the same concept makes it even more difficult to study entrepreneurship as a process. To make a little illustration, Metro. We are in Stockholm, so I guess you are all familiar with Metro, the free sheet, which was founded in Stockholm back in 1995. And illustrating how different the notion of new venture idea is from the notion of objective pre-existing opportunity, right? So basically the new venture idea here was to provide commuters with a free daily newspaper of decent journalistic quality by saving on distribution and production cost, covering costs and generating profits solely from advertising. And this idea is pretty stable regardless where you go with Metro. This is kind of the idea. I don't know how central commuting is to the idea anymore, but that was in the early days at least. Okay, what was the constellation of objective pre-existing conditions in Stockholm in 1995 that made the initial Metro a success? Being Swedish and of my age and having lived in Stockholm for 10 years, 9 years just prior to this, I can, at least in arrears, list a few things that. So we have in this country, or at least we had, a very high literacy rate and a very high incidence of regularly reading morning papers. Right? Back in the day, in most households, you got the morning paper delivered to your home in the morning, right, before the start of the workday. We have high minimum wages, which means high distribution costs and high prices of traditional papers. In fact, a lecturer at the School of Journalism here in Stockholm had been preaching for 20 years before Metro actually happened, that if you can remove the distribution cost, you can give away the paper for free. A well-developed public transportation system, and we have a monopoly provider of that system, so you only need to negotiate and convince one party to get the exclusive distribution of that whole network. And it's not overcrowded, so you can actually sit and read while commuting. You have a culture of keeping to yourself rather than interacting with strangers during commute. Now, Swedes have become more open over time, but we may not be as chatty as Australians, for example, and it certainly was more the case in '95. Strong non-vandalism and non-littering culture, so you could actually just leave the papers there and some bins, and it would sort itself out. When I talked to, like 15 years ago, I talked to students in Bangkok about this. So, what do you mean? The street vendors would take all the paper and use it for wrapping, right? so it wouldn't work there under the same organization. You had a traditionalism among incumbent newspaper organizations. So morning papers had to be broadsheet in order to be a serious paper, right? Broadsheet is not so good to read in commute. If it's a tabloid, it's not a morning paper, so you can't have a tabloid in the morning. They have come around with that one. But now, there were new labor-saving technologies, but you also had strong unions that tried to stop this from being introduced. Now, I lost my notes somehow. But anyway, coming back here. we didn't have internet. Now you can read anything from anywhere in your commute, but that didn't exist then. Great advance in 1995 compared to launching Metro today, right? So it is a combination of circumstances unique to the time and place. And we are just not smart enough to work with this kind of complexity as a theoretical construct. In fact, in all likelihood, the founders took a lot of this for granted and did not really analyze it or become aware that all these circumstances coalesced in Stockholm to make this favorable. And they got quite burnt in some of the other early places they went to. I think they went to Santiago, Boston, Paris, Zurich, and so forth. And in a few of those places, they had disastrous outcomes. But they're still around, and they're very big. So what we're trying to do here with the external what we have very modestly called the theory of external enablement of entrepreneurship, we seek generalizable insights across seemingly different type of change. We want to link aggregate change to venture level action and success. So it is about how, when, why, for what, and for whom do external enablers benefit new businesses. And what's the point of this? This is a long warm-up, right? I've used half my time for the warm-up now. So what we're doing is we're trying to develop language. So the framework and its vocabulary provides language and structure for analyzing how external changes can be useful to particular startups, or for corporate venturing, or for achieving growth of established businesses. So it's a tool to guide our thinking and action. Back to the characteristics. Scope and onset. Characteristics of the enablers themselves. So we have spatial scope. Is this something very local, or is it global? Does it reach the whole world, or is it somewhere in between? Sectoral scope, is this something that affects a single industry, or does it affect some industries, or does it affect every industry there is? What is the temporal scope? Is this something that, it's sort of akin to the notion of window of opportunity, right? Is this something that for a very long time is going to open up new possibilities for new ventures, or is it something that is very limited in time? And the socio-demographic scope, is this something that is going to affect all human beings, or is it, for example, a new technology that is only relevant to those who suffer from some particular medical condition? Or is it a regulatory change that is only relevant to people of a certain age group, or so forth? So we can map this. So we take a couple of those dimensions here, the spatial scope and the sectoral scope, and I have put some external enablers into this and this map, and we could argue about some of them. But you have on the one extreme some industry and country specific deregulation, legalization of marijuana. That is relatively limited spatial scope, or if it is all the US, it's quite big economically, but you have those that are smaller than that. It is sort of a local city council that change some regulation, for example. And you have things like the internet. I mean, it changes everything over time, right? So, and then you have things that are in between. Technologies tend to be relatively broad spatial scope. The sectoral scope might vary. So crowdfunding has broader sectoral scope, arguably, than three-dimensional printing, because 3D printing is about physical objects, whereas crowdfunding could be relevant to most industries, and so forth. You could map temporal scope and socio-demographic scope. I haven't mapped anything there because I want to tease you to trigger your own imagination where you would put things there. So And of course, you could do this with more than 2 dimensions, but it's difficult to draw. 3 dimensions, tough already. 4, forget it. So, some preliminary ideas about the importance of scope here. So, greater scope, bigger market potential for new ventures that exploit that external enabler. So that seems to be a positive there. And this is from the perspective of independent new startups, right? But if the scope is greater, then you're less likely to avoid competition from the big behemoths of this world. So that could be a negative. So that's on the other hand. On the third hand, you may, if you go for it, you may be more likely to become an attractive acquisition target. And in this situation, that maybe should be your strategy rather than stubbornly trying to create something that survives as an independent entity. If the scope is really, really large, then the big guys will move eventually. So a lesser scope implies a niche market, and that may be a more defensible space for a new small business. So if you don't have those fantastic ambitions that you're going to change the whole world, that may be a better space to move. But then if you think again, this may not be the same across all dimensions of scope, right? So what if the spatial scope is large and you have a sectoral and socio-demographic scope are also large? Well, this is not a description of one opportunity here, right? This means that there will be room for many, many different ways of exploiting the external enabler. And you can find niches here that, and you can even do a puppy dog ploy, so you pretend to do something nichey, and secretly you really want to undo that big competitor, but you don't want them to know about it just yet. No single actor will have the ability or inclination to go for all of this, right? So there will be room for many to act on an enabler of that type. The onset can be very predictable and gradual, like an aging population. A migration crisis, more sudden, more unpredictable. A political coup in what is otherwise a stable political environment would be very unexpected and happen very sudden. Legalization of marijuana is sort of, I thought I meant that to be, relatively predictable, because there is a process leading to this, but the actual date when it goes from illegal to legal is still sudden, right? So, I've learned more recently that there is a lot of variation within the US in exactly how this legalization has taken place on local and state level. So it's a really good research laboratory, actually. So with a more predictable and gradual onset, you have something that is much easier to work with. That's good. Unfortunately, that is true for every other actor as well, so it doesn't give you much of an advantage. If something is less predictable and more sudden, arguably it is easier for a small, nimble actor, like an independent startup, to act on that. Now, talk about horrible external enablers here, but only days after the terrorist attack on Charlie Hebdo in Paris, you could buy a Je suis Charlie t-shirt to express your emotions about this. You would not find that at H&M or Uniqlo or even Zara, although they are famous for being fast and nimble for a large company. This is typically the domain for a small local actor, eventually an online actor, but not a big branded thing. By the way, it was not just t-shirts, you had all kinds of products, including earrings with Je suis Charlie, which also sort of gives you a bad taste. There's one thing is offering people an opportunity to express what they feel about this and feeling united about it. Another one is sort of the shameless exploitation of a terrible event, right? So, unfortunately, this logic that less predictable, more sudden is the domain for a small local actor. It doesn't really hold up if fast action requires big resources. Then again, you could ask who will act if fast action requires big resources. Possibly a very successful entrepreneur who already is a billionaire. They can act in that space. Large organizations just can't be that fast, right, most of the time. The same type of external enabler can have different characteristics. Just one illustration here, all related to changes in climate, weather. You can have an unusual hot and sunny summer. We just had one. Usually those kinds of events have limited spatial and sectoral and temporal scope. There are some industries that are affected by climate. This particular summer you just had was actually also of an unusual spatial scope, but that is unusual. Not very predictable. Mostly this will have the effect of making some small actors lucky. You can't really plan for it, so someone decides to rent the kiosk at the beach and makes a killing because the beach is full all summer. Next year someone will have to pay more for that rent and will hope to have the same and will get unlucky because it will not be a good summer. Reflecting what we always do, so over-rewarding luck and over-punishing bad luck. We do that in all sectors of human endeavor. Then you have weather patterns that goes for 5 to 10 years, and we have this happening in Australia, for example. So there's a medium spatial, sectoral, and temporal scope here. So there are parts of the world, significant parts of the world that are affected. So you have some kind of predictability. You don't know exactly when these things will turn, and you don't know in detail what the weather will be, but you can sort of tell, well, we have gotten into that. We will not have very rainy summers now for the next few years, right? So there is potential for strategic use in weather-sensitive industries. And then you have global climate change, and this is something that is going to affect a lot. So it has very broad scope. We could argue about the predictability, I guess. It will arguably have a major role in many types of new business over a long period of time. And there are actually quite a number of industries that are weather sensitives also in the short and medium term. So we have tourism, water tanks, sunglasses, wind and solar energy, agriculture, anything that is depending on wind, irrigation and sunscreen and umbrellas and clothes and whatever. So quite a bit. In summary, scope and onset of external enablers influence the degree of strategic actionability pertaining to the external enabler. Is this something you can use strategically, or does it just happen? Do you just get lucky or unlucky from them? It affects the magnitude of the potential for new businesses that are exploiting the particular external enabler. And it has implications for who is more likely to successfully exploit this external enabler. Is it an independent small actor? Is it a large company or something else? So we move on to mechanisms. So now we're down to the level of the individual venture and the precise benefits that they can get from an enabler. So in that bigger picture, we say it specifies the cause-effect relationship. This means it describes what benefits particular new ventures can derive from a particular enabler. And we have, on the demand side, we have come up with some fancy names for all of these mechanisms. So compression means saving time. So 3D printing, for example, shortening development times. They also make them cheaper, of course. You may have a deregulation that simplifies the startup process. Conservation reduces the amount of resources required to perform an activity. So to take a natural environment, so example, change it to natural environment may reduce the need for cooling or for heating or for irrigation and things like that. Resource expansion, an increase in the amount of resources that is accessible, and we already talked about an example there with the now idle resources from closing, from breweries that are closing down, that you could redeploy at a reduced rate in soft drink startups. We also have resource substitution, so you can replace one resource with another one. One non-obvious example there that as attitudes in society have been towards becoming more inclusive of people with various kinds of handicaps, and advances in medical science pointing out that people with autistic characteristics are actually better than normal people on certain tasks. So they are, for example, used in software development for that reason. Generation is a mechanism that creates new artifacts or new functionality. And I struggle to find other examples than technologies for this one, I have to say. So you have new technology that makes new functionality possible. Combination mechanisms is that you latch onto something that already exists, and you can use all that functionality, and you just add your thing, right? And we talked about this as a combination mechanism, that refrigeration increases the attractiveness of soft drinks in that era. The primary example in recent times is smart devices and apps, right? So all the functionality that is already there can be used, and you add something to it. On the demand side, the external change can reduce uncertainty. Wouldn't we want this one? A broad political agreement that creates expectation of long-term stability. Legitimation, something that increases the legality or psychological, social, cultural acceptability of the venture and its offering. So it's not just about formal regulation, but also about what is generally perceived as being okay and not so okay, right? Demand expansion, if you have a macroeconomic boom, you have a lot of increase in discretionary income, and that increases demand without this being at the cost of something else, which is demand substitution. So you can have an increase in demand for, I mean, if it's a terrorist attack or if it is a crime wave or something like this, people will invest more in safety products, and something else will have to give then. So we have some examples like ocelot furs are not that in anymore, so you probably substitute that for some other, or you move to some other kind of luxury consumption instead. Like I said, the safety equipment there in response to something that make people more fearing about what bad things will kind of happen to them. We had the demand substitution of soft drinks versus beer, and these are what we call lollies in Australia, candy. This is one of the types of products that benefit from a downturn in the economy. When you can't give yourself big treats, you turn to small treats. So there's some kind of products that actually benefit from the economic conditions worsening. And then we have what we call enclosing. So something that increases the venture's ability to appropriate the value that they create. And the most typical one being some change in IP legislation, but you may also have technology that we have had technological development that makes it much easier to store information about your customers and loyalty programs and so forth, so that you can can lock them in better. But there may also be completely different kinds of enablers, like war, that create these shortages and limited competitions that make it easier to appropriate the value. There can be all other kinds of regulatory changes that reduces competition for some reason. So agency, intensity, and opacity, these are characteristics of mechanisms. Some mechanisms are obvious to anyone. More children, more childcare. Easy. Others require specialized knowledge or creative, unique ingenuity. And agency intensity. Some mechanisms work without any deliberate action. There's change in the climate, change in demand for some climate-sensitive products. You don't even have to realize that the climate has changed. It is going to affect the bottom line anyway. Others require a lot of hard work. That is often the case with you have some general technology and you try to develop some specific application of this technology, and that doesn't come all that easily. So exploiting opaque and agency-intensive external enablers, that will make things more costly, more risky, but also in all likelihood leading to something, in the successful cases, leading to something that where you can really have a competitive advantage in the end. So mechanisms facilitate superior supply, boost demand, or increase value appropriation. Opacity and agency intensity of mechanisms affect their risk-reward trade-off. So more opacity, more agency intensity, competitive advantage if you're successful. So we can use this and observing an external enabler, ask yourselves, what particular mechanism can this external enabler offer with regard to the design and cost, the price of the product, the design, the structure and process of the venture, or can it make the venture creation process faster and cheaper? And for what type of venture? If we don't start from a locked-in venture, you start from clean slate, then you can see search more broadly. What kind of venture can really get a lot of benefit out of this external change? You can turn it around. So after identifying a problem, you can ask yourself, what external enabler out there can provide the mechanisms that we need? Now something funny has happened here. Well, they're supposed to be that general framework, the overall framework. I don't know what happened there. So I talked quickly about this before. Triggering being a reason for starting the process, or a contributing reason for starting the process in anticipation of some of those mechanisms. Outcome enhancing, leading to better results than you would have in the absence of the enabler. So they are partly different, and sometimes ventures are successful for reasons they never realize or realize only later in the journey. So the start of the journey is not the only time when there is reason to scan the environment for things that can be beneficial. Then we have the shaping role, and that is, it's often an exaggerated focus on the product in certain types of ventures. So, and those external changes can affect the product, like with apps and with the socio-cultural t-shirt. Without that event, you wouldn't produce such a thing. In other cases, it is some minor part of the product. It is some kind of functionality. It's not the main reason for the product, but it may be some product feature. The change can affect the venture, the business model, the organization of the venture. What we're part of here, sort of the startup movement can be seen as a social movement in its own right. And some of the mantras that are repeated in that culture will affect the journeys of some ventures, and they will make decisions about the organization of venture that they wouldn't otherwise have done, and in some cases this will be to their benefit, and then this has been an external enabler. You also have process technologies, for example, that that affect how a venture is organized. And then it can affect the process of making the business happen, and then it's over. So it's not part of the venture itself or its market offerings, but it made it possible to create this venture in the first place. So there's reason to look for beneficial mechanism across those different roles, different shaping roles. Okay, so I'm done with the framework now. And this paper where I criticized the entrepreneurial opportunity construct, and I came up with this idea of external labor. That was one step, and then we worked on this paper with my colleagues Fredrik von Briel and Jan Rekke. They are the ones who know anything about technology. I don't. So we looked at technological enablers specifically, and then we got a lot of ideas from that process that led to this framework. But when we worked on this paper, we looked at this across the process. And we adopted what we call the Backer-Shepard model, because René Backer and Dean Shepard had used this in the paper. It's so Backer-Shepard BS, so we call it the BS model. This is just from the mining industry, right? And they have very clear stages in the mining industry. So you have prospecting, relatively inexpensive, nothing is inexpensive in absolute terms in mining, but relatively inexpensive exploration stage, right? Then you have developing, when you're still not in production, but you're pouring some serious money into this. And then you have exploiting, which is full scale and very, very costly in mining. We say, well, all the mining is very particular, but those stages can actually make sense in other contexts as well, but it looks more like this. So it's not like the whole venture is in one stage and then the whole venture moves into the same. But you have different kinds of activities going on in the startup process, and they move forward and come together, some of them, to what is eventually exploited. I thought that was really interesting to make that process related analysis, because we found that the different new digital technologies provided different enabling mechanisms across all three stages of IT hardware venture creation. And then we thought about that and said, okay, say that you introduce some kind of policies, regulatory changes, because that is what policies most directly can affect. If you enable just prospecting, the relatively inexpensive playing at the end of starting a venture, then success chances for individual ventures may actually go down, because you have even more competition in the later critical stages where you need external money, and in the end you may not have so much of an effect. So it has some implications for if you want to help more new ventures becoming realized, then you may want to have this process view on it and make sure that you don't just help the start of the process or the end of the process, but try to give something across the process. And these are just some of the conclusions. But let's say, if only exploiting is provided, that is pretty sort of far from current reality for an independent startup. But it is what large established organizations have as their main focus. So if there are things that mainly facilitate exploiting, then that may be something that incumbent firms are more likely to move on. So this was where we're going. Okay. We argue that all external changes enable some businesses. Even if it hurts many more businesses than it helps, it helps some businesses. And if you are a not yet existing business, you don't have to worry about what it hurts. You just have to seek out the domain that it helps. Right? So this framework and concept provides structure and language to analyze how, when, why, for what, and for whom does an external change help new business. The scope and onset of external enablers affect their potential, or rather the potential of ventures using them, and for whom they can more easily be used. By whom they more easily become used. Mechanisms and rules of external enablers specify how, when, and for what enablers can help, for example, improving supply, increasing demand, or increasing appropriability. Is the enablement of the product offering, or of the venture in its organization, or of the process of creating the venture. And he or she who is the best at identifying external and using external enablers will win. That's all. Okay.
Thank you, Per. I suppose you have a lot of questions. Just wave your hand and we will. Okay, thank you.
Well, my name is Dan Hjalmarsson, and I really enjoyed your language. But could you, and you said at the end that if you use that language, you will win. Could you validate that? Could you validate that with some kind of quantitative analysis?
No, that was not the most serious statement of. But I do think that not only researchers, but all human beings, most of the time, underemphasize situational factors, and I think both researchers and entrepreneurship practitioners have reason to deepen the analysis of what exactly can those things do for what kind of venture. I have absolutely no evidence. Well, I could say, well, if we look at the last few decades and the biggest entrepreneurial successes, there has definitely been a lot of technological enablement there, and certainly some regulatory enablement, and often also socio-cultural development. So they are attuned to how people's values and so forth are developing. I think even if you can't nail that evidence, I think it's a relatively riskless statement. So this is important, and I think we should develop more effective language and theorizing around and conceptual tools for working with this.
Thank you. Someone else? Yes.
Thank you for an interesting lecture. My name is Robert Livet, and I'm an entrepreneur in finance. And what could be interesting here is if I understand you correctly, then the environmental changes will create opportunities for entrepreneurs, and it's just the matter is just how you can find them and evaluate them and so on. But so if you do this systematically, you can more or less you can be much faster in realizing how to act upon environmental changes. Is that correctly understood?
Yeah, if you sort of have this as one type of lens through which you observe the environment, I think that can be helpful, and for some purposes more effective than a pestle list, right? So which is always by categories of types of changes and very detailed, but doesn't really provide you with more generalizable concepts with which to approach a particular change. And when it comes to climate change, for example, as an Australian, one of my hobby horses is that our country is blessed with wildfires, droughts, cyclones, and flooding. These are kinds of events that are predicted to become more common in other parts of the world. We should use that experience and expertise systematically to become really good at using this knowledge for commercial benefit. And, yeah.
Thank you. One question here.
Okay, I just want to make a comment because I think that Netflix has made the lesson. Netflix has made a big lesson and has made the analysis that you are asking for. So, oh, you cannot hear what I'm saying.
Okay. Would you want to specify in the ways in which you make that connection?
Because I could see that they have analyzed the situation. They have started. I mean, they have made everything right, and I think that they are having like 5 million people watching in Sweden.
Yeah.
And all over the world, I don't know how much, but they are really changing the world with their successful industry.
Yes.
Someone else? You have one more?
Well, I have one more comment. I really enjoy the 3 stages because I was all the time thinking about where is the dynamics. And I think one of the most striking parts is that you do this analysis at the beginning, midterm, and ongoing. And I think that is something extra I haven't seen before in this kind of analysis.
Yeah. That is one of the things that I really liked about. I can tell a little bit about. This has been the most enjoyable research collaboration I had in recent years, and those my co-authors are not originally from business, but they are from information systems, but have relatively similar research cultures. And it was the junior partner of these two who. They were working on this paper, and he saw a connection to my external labor concept, but they had they sort of startup versus growth. It was too coarse-grained, and so we changed that. But for me, that was something that gave more than I realized early on that it would give to do this. And it is something so actually the 2 things I want to focus on the next few years is external enablement and entrepreneurship as process, because both of these are that's right at the heart of what we're doing and things we have struggled with getting right, I would say. So I would just agree that that turned out to be something that gave more insights than we realized when we started it.
We have one more question here.
My name is Magnus Höj. I'm managing trade association for architects and engineers at the moment. With your outside perspective, I guess you've been working in Sweden for quite some time, and with your background now from the outside, and as you know, we have a situation where we're trying to form a government in Sweden. What would your best advice be to the new government in order to improve the situation for entrepreneurs in Sweden?
I shouldn't really give an answer to that question because I don't live here and I haven't followed everything in detail. Sweden is not doing too badly, I must say. Sweden and Stockholm amazes the world, and things are on some dimensions quite good. To have the political mess we have right now is not good for any part of the economy, I think, and we do quite a bit of that in Australia as well. We have the 4 latest prime ministers have been ousted by their own, so it's like a bit like being the Roman emperor, and I have to check your back all the time. And the politicians are also the least progressive in society. I mean, to the extent that when the large energy companies try to move out of coal, the politicians try to convince them to keep it open longer to save jobs. So back to Sweden. I think under the long and very impressive era of social democrat building of society, a lot of things improved, but not only the social democrats, but the other side of politics forgot about the regrowth of the economy. And I've read one of Statens offentliga utredningar, whatever that is in English, from the late 70s. It was fascinating how totally forgotten. They were only quarreling how to divide the pie, not how to create the pie. That was so taken for granted that we once and for all have our large industrial companies and they fix the economy, and so it was forgotten. But I think a process appeared to have started in time in changing both regulatory frameworks and sort of the attitudes in society in order to create a change. And then one thing that amazes me about Sweden is that it punches above its weight in so many areas. And you don't need to have 95% of the population being entrepreneurial, but you need to have enough of a significant minority. And in a relatively egalitarian society, I think you broaden that base. In most countries in this world, most people feel very, very small in this world and could never imagine being a player on the world stage. I think that comes a little bit easier with I mean, I'm a bit of an academic entrepreneur, in which it came very easily to me that, of course, I can be a player in entrepreneurship research globally, which was easier back then because it was an almost non-existing field when I started. But Sweden really fascinates me in that regard, that it gives enough room to enough individuals, I think, so you get this significant minority.
Thank you.
And that has very little to do with specific entrepreneurship policies. It has to do with how society at large is organized.
Hi there, my name is Joachim Jansson, working at Dig Journey. Having studied the external enablers for so long, I'm pretty sure you have seen a lot of companies doing good or not so good in using these external factors. So what internal capabilities have you seen that as similarities for those who succeed in actually taking advantage of the external enablers?
I can't answer that yet because I haven't been at this for very long, actually. So that it's a relatively recent research interest of mine. I have dabbled a bit with a couple of publications in dynamic capabilities, which would be relevant to this, but I'm not really deep into that field either. But I mean, you have some concepts like dynamic capabilities, absorptive capacity, and so forth that would be relevant on the organizational level to this, and you could study it more specifically in relation to this. Interestingly, it is not just entrepreneurship that has sort of not been completely blind, but had struggled a bit with this. Also in strategy, I mean, there were strategy literatures on the SWOT, strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and on environmental scanning, and early attempts to theorize across different types of external changes in the 80s. But then that sort of either petered out or the interest shifted too much towards how do people perceive changes rather than what do those objective facts out there. And strategy has been, after the Porter era, which was more externally oriented, has since been more oriented towards the eternal capacity of the firm, without relating that strongly enough to what is happening in the external world. So.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? Yes, one more.
Hi, thanks for a great lecture. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
I'm Örjan Nilsson, I'm a psychologist and business developer. I think I love the more concepts of understanding.
Okay.
Now it's on.
Yeah.
Örjan Nilsson, psychologist and business developer. I love you bringing complexity to this issue about entrepreneurship. But I was thinking, is this still a model of thinking that's too rational? Could you elaborate on the role of chance or luck, for instance?
Well, we try to make more room for that. One of the problems with Shane and Venkat's conceptualization of the individual and the opportunity, and what has become called the discovery view or discovery theory, is that it is sort of assumed that all the conditions that make the venture successfully that not only exists at the start, they also correctly perceived by the actor. We try to move away from that and allow for sort of, well, they see something, but there is a process, and then they may see something else later on that is beneficial, and sometimes they may get lucky. They don't have to. They don't even have to have perceived or anticipated those beneficial mechanisms. They may still get lucky. So we try to actually move more in that direction compared to what we are most immediately comparing ourselves to.
Perfect. With that, I think, yeah, we're done.
Yeah.
Thank you, Per.
Okay, thank you so much.
Esprit likes both knowledge and recycling very much. So we have 2 gifts for you. We support UNICEF's School in the Box. And this bowl is made of recycled glass from Torstensson Art. So with that, thank you very much for taking your time. Next lecture is on November 13. We will send invitations soon. And now, coffee and buns, please.